Foreign policy seems to be a focus now. It wasn't before, it was economics, and we used to have guests come on this programme and talk about an isolationist America, America first and the world second. That seems to be changing. Why an increasing focus on foreign policy, whilst at home we have the difficulties with the economics?
Well, I think it's just a natural progression of sitting in the Oval Office. You saw the president on the campaign trail was very much focused on the U.S. economy and jobs and the fact that jobs had been moving overseas, and he made a lot of promises as regards domestic policy. But of course, when a president gets into office, he can't ignore what's happening on the world stage. So I think this is actually a later trip overseas than most presidents have taken when they first take office, and I think this is kind of the natural progression of this president's focus in office. He will certainly be pivoting back to domestic policy when Congress returns after the Memorial Day recess.
Ebrahim, is he being overtaken by events on the world stage and being consumed by them? And to some extent, is that to his advantage because things aren't going so well at home?
Well, I think the first thing is he's actually unusually late in making his first foreign trip. So I think it actually does rhyme with his general agenda of putting domestic matters first. But I think it is true that obviously over the last few weeks, we've seen a number of developments, both domestic and international, that probably weren't part of his initial agenda. I think trying to shift the focus right now is probably to his advantage. But as you know, internationally, he's actually met with a fair amount of skepticism. So I don't think this has been the easiest of trips either.
So, Peter, as we've said, a president doesn't get to set all of his agenda as a practical matter. Things come up. At the same time, this president came in with a remarkably extensive agenda. We have health care, we have the budget, we have infrastructure, we have deregulation. What is the situation in Washington now with respect to focus and priorities? Is this administration focused on what comes first, what they need to get done, and what is it?
This administration is focused on what they need to do domestically. Obviously, there have been a lot of distractions in the press, and of course, the overseas trip has taken a little bit of the focus off. But the domestic policy agenda remains as it was when the president first took office, and that's deregulation, which largely they've achieved so far. They still have some additional steps to take there. But on health care, that was the priority coming in. That was a campaign promise that had been made, not just by this president, but also by the Republican Congress. So that was the first thing that they needed to execute on. Tax reform comes after health care, and we believe that both of those two initiatives remain on track. Our view is that the Senate will be able to pass the revised health care bill, and the House will pass it as well before the August recess. And then they'll pivot to the budget and tax reform, and we think that'll take the better part of this calendar year and probably into early next year. But those two items are still on track, and we think actually what's been happening with the Russia story has given the members of Congress a bit of actual breathing room on some of these nitty-gritty of these policy measures.
So, Ebrahim, as Peter says, healthcare is, as it turns out, turned to be #1 in line. As far as financial markets go, as far as business goes, is that largely a distraction? Is it really tax reform that they're looking for?
By and large, the answer is yes. It's a distraction, but it might well be a necessary component of the agenda. So in that sense, it's very important. But it's not entirely true. If you look at small businesses, and if you look at the small business surveys, then the high cost of healthcare was, for a while, one of their major concerns. And I think one of their expectations from this presidency was actually that they would be able to bring down the cost of healthcare, which would help the small businesses. So I think it's certainly less important than tax reform overall, but it's not insignificant.
So 5 months ago, let's go back to January. Tell me what your base case was for tax reform then, and now tell me what your base case is for tax reform now.
I'm glad you asked in a way, because we actually haven't shifted, and it's roughly in line with what we just heard. So our base case is that we will get a significant tax reform, which is really tax cuts, around the end of the year, Q4, Q1, that will be deficit increasing. And as we just heard, I think you could roughly say it's still on track. But the importance there is that the difficult parts are still to come. We really haven't seen any movement towards compromise or towards substantive progress.
Peter Cohn, has your base case shifted in the last 5 months, or like Ebrahim, has it stayed pretty much the same?
It stayed pretty much the same. If anything, I think we've gotten a little bit more bullish on tax reform happening prior to the midterm elections. We still think it'll probably get done by the end of Q1 of next year. It could slip a little bit. But generally, we've been very bullish on tax reform happening. If anything, what's happening right now, the other distractions that are detracting a little bit from the domestic policy initiatives have lit a fire under the Republican leadership in Congress, and they believe that it really is an imperative for them to complete action on tax reform, specifically tax reform. before the midterm elections and to begin to see the impact of tax reform coursing through the economy before voters go to the polls.
So Peter, Ebrahim just put together tax reform and tax cuts as sort of more or less the same thing. Economists often say that's not right, that in fact tax reform is much more important for pro-growth. Is tax reform harder to get through the Congress than tax cuts?
Yes, tax reform will always be harder to get through Congress, but I think we should be clear that when we talk about tax reform, the rules of the Congress have changed since 2015, where now you can take into account the macroeconomic feedback associated with tax cuts. So you don't really have to necessarily fully pay for tax reform with revenue increases elsewhere, but you can count the macroeconomic feedback through dynamic scoring. So ultimately what we are looking at is a tax cut, but it will be, in fact, it will look as if on paper that it's revenue neutral, but it will in fact be a tax cut.